Launch auto sequence has started.
Crew one for all.
Hi, I'm Ed Hoffman. Really thrilled to be here with you, Jessica.
We're joining you as the Fourth Wall podcast, brought to you by XpoNorth Digital.
And we're going to be blasting off a creative mind in person in Clive Gillman,
who's head of the Creative Industries at Creative Scotland.
I'm looking forward to this.
It's very exciting, Ed. Welcome, Clive. We're so happy to have you. Ed had the coolest job in the world. I think, Clive, you may have a close second. That seems like an incredible position to have.
Yes. Yeah, I did the whole kind of fine art degree, fine art masters, working as an artist probably for about 15, 20 years, freelancing, and gradually shifted into setting up and running organizations, and then have ended up in the position I am now, where I'm sort of pretty much some distance away from practicing and making stuff, although I still do it, but it's harder to do it, I think, when you're kind of so absorbed in the structures of the cultural and creative sector.
On this show, although we really like you, we are going to send you to the moon. Before we do that and hear what choices you've made for your movies, I have a question for both of you, Ed and Clive. Both of you have been at the top of quite aspirational organizations that are trying to do things that have never existed before. So in that case, how do you know that you're doing something successfully? What are the metrics that you use to say, okay, if anything's possible, how do we know that we are achieving what we want?
Well, I mean, I'm smiling at that because whenever I hear the word metrics or measure, I because I'd get that at NASA a lot, and I remember showing measures to leaders. And when the leaders liked the vision and the story, then the metrics were good. When they didn't like the story, then the metrics were bad. So to a certain extent, I think creativity and outcomes and going to the moon is about you have a destination and you work with smart people, and they have a sense when you're getting closer, like a sailor does. And they know when they're getting further away, and then they adjust. I think from sailing, you don't ever have an exact line, right? Because the winds and everything are taking you. But I think it's having a clear sense of the dream, the vision, the mission. You know that's and then you know when you're getting closer, and you know when you're starting to slip away.
I always hold on to that notion that I retain the right not to be solely measured by things that you can count. So the idea that success, the measure of success, is something that exists in a bit more of an anthropological space than an arithmetic space, that it's actually just to do with people agreeing that something is successful. And I quite like that. I quite like the idea that it's quite mutable and it's constantly moving forwards, and that even in the process of achieving some notion of success, you are resetting the boundaries, you're resetting the goals, the horizons for what you might consider to be success next, or beyond what you've just done. So for me, I quite like the idea that success on some levels is unattainable, but that also success is actually part of a conversation. It's an anthropological thing. It's something that people together recognize as being of value.
I love that, because I think, particularly when you're doing a project, the project is always flowing.
Yes.
I always tell teams, don't get too happy right now with all the good data, because in another hour, something can totally change.
Yeah, but I guess that the flow, being in the zone, success actually fractures that a little bit, because it actually takes you out of the zone. It takes you out of the flow. So I suppose let's say success is overrated.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you sound like a NASA guy. The biggest danger to a NASA project is complacency. And complacency is when people, and I've seen it, you can see it on the team, where they think they're successful. They know that they're smart. They don't make those dumb mistakes. Those older people make those dumb mistakes. And then all of a sudden, that complacency literally explodes. And it changes things. The safest time to fly is after a disaster.
Yes.
Because everyone is really locked in.
We're sending you to the moon. We're populating the moon with people that we think really need it. And so we're going to set up a colony there. We have a couple people there maybe already that you can hang out with. But on your journey, you will only get 3 movies to take with you. They could be DVDs. I think we decided DVDs or Laserdiscs, Ed, will survive the journey.
Sure, 4K.
4K. So, Clive, what is your first movie?
I was working on the basis that the moon is a pretty lonely place. It doesn't have a lot of colour. Some of the things that would be very important to me would be to try and maintain that sense of being human. And linking back to the things that I think we've just been discussing here around processes of creativity. And so I think the first movie that I thought of in relation to that is a movie by the French filmmaker Claire Denis, which is called 35 Shots of Rum.
Ton père est pas rentré, y a pas de lumière chez vous. Moi aussi je pars. On veut très bien faire comme lui.
Ça arrive à rien tout ça. Pense un peu à toi.
Ben c'est pas mon jour. Vous croyez que j'aurai une course pour Roissy ou Saint-Cloud? Ben non.
It's actually a really interesting movie because when you say what it's about, it's really hard to actually just say what it is about. It's about an extended family living in a block of flats in Paris and the relationships that they have between themselves and where those relationships go. But the film is all about those nuances of humanity, the looks, the glances, the small expressions that happen between people, which makes it sound very kind of a little bit dull, a little bit kind of art house, but actually it's a beautiful film which just takes you on this journey through a period in these people's lives. And it just seems to reinforce so many of those things about what it is to be human. It's got nobody is aggrandized within it. You don't get the sense that anyone is the principal interest, that everybody who enters into the space is a character worthy of attention. And it has a lovely soundtrack, and it's full of quite mundane details of planet Earth. So actually looking from the moon, it felt like a really nice thing to have to fall back on, to try and connect back with those things that are about being human, that we often don't see when they're around us, but actually to see them transplanted into a linear narrative in a film like this one that is so poetically constructed would be an absolute joy just to revisit that and reconnect with it.
It's also visually so sensitive. You know, sometimes you could turn off the sound and still what you said about the small glances or even the way people are posed in the frame, you can understand the power dynamics, what's exchanged between people. It's sensual in that way.
I've liked it for quite a long time, and I think actually having this opportunity to talk about it in a particular context, I think helped me to realise what it is about it that I really like, because actually it's not a film that you can easily describe to somebody what it's actually about, because essentially what it's about is just being human, and there's something really powerful in that.
You're right, and it leaves you with those feelings that are feelings between feelings. So it doesn't leave you sad, it doesn't leave you exuberantly happy, but there's this quality that it leaves you with that lingers.
Yes, it's full of emotional semi-quavers. So it has these kinds of little notes that are playing off all the time that are kind of not giving you a big grand narrative. They're just kind of fleshing out all of these different ways of being, and it's lovely for that.
A lot of it is about a father and a daughter and the relationship, as you said, between kind of their found family of the people who live in the apartment, and some really lovely moments between them, intimate moments, knowing moments of knowing someone else. Where did you grow up? What community did you start fostering your interest in the arts?
I grew up in a part of London that nobody ever really goes to. Although actually I think it might have got quite trendy more recently, but it's sort of Leighton, East London, that area. My dad was a keen photographer, amateur photographer. He was a musician. My mother was also a musician. But we never really had a sense in which there was such a thing, I suppose, as an arts career, as a creative career. It was something that I kind of stumbled into. I didn't even know that there was such a thing as art school that you could go and study at. And so I think I kind of went on this quite lovely journey where I got very interested in in photography and this whole idea of technological art forms that just kept unraveling for me into this kind of journey. So I got very involved in photography, but then started to learn about other forms, filmmaking, sound, video, and ultimately went to art school and explored the burgeoning practice of video art, and then went further beyond that into digital art forms, looking at making interactive works and making interactive public artworks, online works. And so I was very interested in just following this thread of technological possibility for creativity. And I suppose the technology was evolving very quickly at that time, so there were new experiences to be had through it, new paradigms to be defined around creative practice. So I kind of just fell through all these things in a very pleasant way, playing with them as it went and producing things that ended up getting exhibited or shown. So that was a really nice thing to do. And what I suppose what I was drawing on that in terms of where I came from, I actually don't know. I mean, I suppose growing up in a place like London, there are certain experiences that I guess you take for granted, things that you can just go to because they're down the road. But to be honest, I don't know how much they might have coloured that for me. It's difficult to know. It's difficult to abstract yourself from your own circumstances in that way to know what effect they might have had. But yeah, that was the journey anyway towards trying to do things creatively.
Do you still have your own artistic practice now?
Because of my job, I do things under an assumed name, which I won't tell you what it is, but I make works under a different name, and so
is it Banksy?
If only. No, but it gives me a chance just to do stuff without any kind of particular expectation of where it might go and what might happen to it. But also, actually, it allows me a little bit to understand what it is to be outside the system a little bit as well. So actually kind of being an artist without a reputation and trying to make works and find ways to get that work shown, seeing how that works and seeing how that sometimes or quite often doesn't work is actually quite an interesting learning journey to be on as well.
Wow, it's so interesting. Well, Ed, do you understand that? Because you've always had kind of a foot in the system and then a foot from an outside perspective. Do you think that's the best way to serve an organization? One
of the things I always said to my team, fly under the radar. I would have some people, you can always tell someone new, they loved the idea and they wanted to tell everybody and they wanted to go. I said, no. You, particularly when you're doing something creative or different, basically it's something that's a threat to the system because it's new. So I would always try to do things quietly. I would try to have the overall support of the direction, because once you get visibility, then you have everyone who wants your idea to die, who won't admit it. For different reasons. Sometimes they're scared of it. Sometimes you represent a change. I remember one of the leaders, this is very early in my career, and what I was about was learning and development. So it's really safe. But I had one senior executive who basically told me, you represent the enemy. And I loved his total bluntness, because people don't usually, I had that reaction you had, Jessica, and he said, well, it's not you as the enemy, but if we start supporting the things you're doing, that's going to take funding away from the things that I think are important. So I have to be honest, I see you as the enemy. And I think, we all tend to love our ideas and think everyone will, and some people will be honest, but a new idea and creativity is a threat to the status. So I think you have to manage it, I think, smart.
There's a whole kind of philosophy around those concepts of emergence, which I think are really interesting in terms of creative practice. So this idea that, some people talk about art today as only being about other art. So in effect, the kind of the self-reflexive nature of creative practice has kind of won out, that you make work that solely achieves through referencing other work. And this idea that as technologies evolve and new ways of doing things emerge, there are things that are perhaps existing within the condition that we might call art, which nobody is really looking at, because actually we haven't yet worked out how to build the reference points to allow us to understand that. And that for me is some of the most interesting things that might be going on. I'm kind of fascinated by the kind of boundaries of creative practice. So the idea of being, where do you cross to say that gardening isn't an art form. And what's that point? I'm endlessly fascinated by those things. What goes on at the centre is really easy to understand, and it's very settled. But actually, in some ways, the things that are really moving us forward, and I think reflecting on all those things that we were talking about a moment ago about kind of what it is to know yourself, are often happening in those kind of, horrible word I know, but in those liminal spaces between the definitions of two things that are absolutely certain. And for me, that's where it starts to get really interesting.
It reminds me of one of my mentors who is a theatre director, Stephen Bogart, would say, what you come into rehearsal with is rehearsal. And what he meant by that was the attitudes, what happened to you that day, all the unconscious stuff, that is the rehearsal. That's kind of how you're approaching choices you're making consciously and subconsciously. And I can imagine that in reverse, where, well, if you're an artist or a creative person, whatever you do starts becoming a creative pursuit.
I try and convince my colleagues at work that every meeting I go to is a piece of theatre, which I kind of think it is. There's a set of rituals, that there is a structure for the performance. The whole process of a meeting is performative. I quite like kind of procedural dramas in that sense. The idea of somebody performing, say, a trial or whatever is really interesting. The whole idea that it's possible to look at things through that lens all the time. And I had somebody who was doing a PhD recently who was talking about, if you are trained as an artist, but then you're not working as an artist, do you work differently? And I mean, the obvious answer to that is actually, I don't know, because I only know what I know. So I cannot be anything other than that to know whether or not it would be different. So I think it's really hard to know that, but I'd like to think that there is something about that process of developing yourself as a creative person that affects all of those different ways of working. I don't know if it's necessarily the case or not, but I'd like to think it can be.
Clive, I'm so glad we're sending you to the moon so that you can start kind of spreading those ideas there. It's so important. And I'm feeling guilty that we've now left you alone with movies, because I think you'll thrive where people are. But what is your second film?
The second film I was going to suggest to take is, I think it's a blatant cheat, but I think you've allowed me to do it. I'm quite interested in the idea of, if you're on the moon, the ability to think about what is human and to reflect on that and to look at humanity. So my second choice is something called No Cinema, which is actually an arts project by an artist called Jerome Joy, who's based in France. And essentially it is a process which brings together created soundtracks with randomized CCTV footage. It's a cheat because it's endless, so I can sit and watch this for as long as I'm there on the moon. But it's a constantly evolving piece where it is bringing together these soundtrack pieces that are created by sound artists with this randomized CCTV footage that is being picked up from around the globe. And I think what happens around it is that when you watch it, you start to construct your own narratives around this work. You start to kind of do those human things of emotionally identifying with what's going on. You build not just narratives, but you build backstories for what you might see evolving in front of you. And you do that very essentially human thing, which is to attempt to build human meaning into everything that you see in that way. And in some ways, the Jerome Joy No Cinema piece is a good one to pick, because it is an endless ongoing project. There are other artists that have worked in this space as well. There's John Thompson and Alison Craighead, who are actually based in Scotland, have done works in this arena as well, where they've used CCTV footage and remixed it for gallery settings. But also there's a couple of interesting artists based in New York, Kevin and Jennifer McCoy, who actually build miniature film sets with multiple cameras in them, and they animate the film sets by cutting between the cameras. So you can watch these in action, but actually build your own narratives when you watch these little model film sets on the tabletops. And perhaps it's drawing on, I think, my own experience of being exposed to quite a lot of structural cinema in the early days, that actually the whole idea of thinking about what is a film, you can only really understand a film when you look through into the film itself as a medium, what the projector is as an object, what the screen is, what is being reflected back to you, all of those things that are representative of the physical aspects of film. You have to go through that to understand what a film is and what a film can be. And that idea that half the time when you're watching a film, you're in the dark, all those kind of interesting notions. But suddenly to see that played out in this way using digital technology and global digital technology. And there's something, I suppose, slightly voyeuristic about it, but actually, hey, you're putting me on the moon. It's okay to be a voyeur if that's what you're doing. So yeah, I had those slight images of The Man Who Fell to Earth and the fairly dark scenes in that. But actually, I would view it as a happy thing to be able to kind of look into watching kind of random cars drive down highways to quite interesting soundtracks.
Ed, have you seen this? Have you visited it yet?
This is brilliant. I can't even find it, Clive. So it's a continuous loop of possibility and living.
I love that it's stimulating. It keeps on changing for you, but then also it exercises your own imagination. So in a way, it plays therapist. So if you're on the moon and you're missing, your friends, suddenly the narrative starts gearing towards your emotional state at the moment. And so that's a lovely interaction between you as storyteller, but also these interesting images and sounds that keep on coming up.
And actually, another aspect of this that was quite important to me is that this shouldn't be inside. So this actually has to be on a kind of 30-meter screen somewhere outside in the landscape, so that there is this kind of interjection of the human world into the sort of barren landscape of the moon. So I didn't want to see this on a little screen inside a kind of pod somewhere. I wanted this to be kind of massive outside, and I would have to kind of kit up to go and experience it, to sit down on the dust and watch it. So
I love that image. You've added a whole new dimension to it now. You're curating another kind of art piece that's happening on the moon. It could be the first ever art piece.
Indeed.
Also, can we talk a little bit for both of you in the No Cinema? There's a real healthy reliance on happy accidents, the kind of felix culpa. How much in your work and in art do you think happy accidents play a part?
Oh, well, for me, every piece of art is actually, I think, just a sequence of happy accidents. And essentially, it's a happy accident most of the time between the work and the viewer, the audience, because actually you can never know what the audience are bringing to the work. Like you were mentioning before about a rehearsal, every presentation of an artwork is a rehearsal for the existence of that artwork. So the idea that the artwork exists in a kind of hermetically sealed environment for me is deeply problematic. I went to art school at the time when the art object was the enemy, that actually you shouldn't be thinking about the creation of more art objects, that actually it should be about other things, other ways of creating experiences. So I think for me, the accident of the encounter between the work and the audience or the person that's engaging with it is one part of that. But also the idea that works can be reflexive, can evolve. I've been involved in making some works in the past that are entirely reflexive. Their whole existence is based on somebody doing something that the work responds to and reacts to. And I really, really like that kind of thing. That for me is a beautiful way to be making works. So the work only exists when somebody interacts with it.
And Ed, I know the word accident may not be a word you throw around at NASA.
No, I love
very
it.
Lately, but
well, yeah, it has a connotation. I look at it a little bit of a different way, because I think I've heard some people attribute success to luck. And one of the quotes that I loved, it was actually a baseball quote from a general manager of Branch Rickey. He said, "Luck is the residue of design." Luck is the residue of design. So there's a preparation, there's a liberation to things. But truthfully, like you, for me, Jessica, were a happy accident, right? We started working together because of a common friend who said, "Oh, you have to meet these person." That led to the happy accident of J. O'Callahan, one of the greatest things, developing the story of NASA. So it's easy to say, "Oh, you got lucky," or it's a happy accident. But if we weren't doing things as human to have a readiness to see, to recognize that happy accident and to adapt to it, it doesn't happen. And to take it to, I guess, the business world, there's a concept of Carol Dweck's called growth mindset. And growth mindset is that you're constantly learning, you're changing. A problem is an opportunity. And the danger is locking into a fixed where you think you've had the answers. And so I love that notion of happy accidents because it means growth and creativity and greenness. And you can't, I always tell people, you cannot guarantee the future, so stop worrying about it. It's going to change. And that's the beauty of it.
There's a whole point in which you sort of tumble into those competing philosophical worldviews, and that idea that all possible outcomes are happening somewhere at once in the multiverse, and not the current product multiverse, but the real conceptual multiverse. So that idea that all possible outcomes are already predetermined by the prior existence of all the circumstances that can create those outcomes. And once you start to think about that, I think it's possible then to lose touch of your place in tumbling through circumstance towards things that bring pleasure. And so, yes, I think those things are interesting, things like luck, but actually, I don't know that they bring anything to help us. And actually, makes me kind of keen to maybe avoid them a little bit, because I just see them as distractions from just living.
I think it's the difference between Greek tragedy and Shakespearean, where you know that the ending is going to happen this way and that there's nothing you can do to change it. And with the Shakespearean kinds of stuff, when you read it, the story can go in any direction. It's up to the fools called humans to determine where you want to go and how you approach it. Always remember that if I'm watching Macbeth, you can change that depending on how you act on it. While as when you're in Epidus or Antigone, the message is you ain't going to change it. So it's very scary.
Yeah, and the other thing I think about often with happy accidents is, especially as a filmmaker, where you have the illusion that you can control everything in front of the camera. Sometimes the best shots, or when a story evolves to the right place, or the best performance is triggered by something out of your control. A bird flies in at the right moment. Something tips over and breaks, and you have to get a replacement, but the replacement's often better. And there's so many times I use the lessons from NASA on film sets, saying, there are no problems, only solutions, when a car couldn't show up or an actor got sick. But often those challenges, those things beyond your control, led to, I think, more successful storytelling, or a bond between the cast and crew, which yielded like a more positive experience on set. And it's not completely out of your control. You can choose how to react to it, but it is wonderful for the ego, especially with creatives, to be reminded that sometimes you don't have the best ideas. Sometimes those happy accidents are the best.
Being in control is a bit of a force god, isn't it? I think
it's so true. And your next movie may display just that in terms of the way things are born. So, Clive, what is your final film?
Okay, my final film, and once again, I have to confess that I'm trying to push the boundaries of what is possible within this opportunity, because I was very aware that there's lots of great movies that I would very happily watch multiple times. But what I kind of wanted to be able to do, if I've only got these three movies, one of which is to pick potentially really long movies, so there's lots of experience within them. So very crude perspective there. But the third movie is kind of a little bit about bringing together that observational nuancing with incredibly long and detailed opportunity to look at something, which is in the second selection. And so the third movie that I'd like to take with me is the Peter Jackson Get Back. So his reworking of the Beatles film that he did of their final set of recording.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Get back, get back, get down where you want to belong.
Another bright day, morning camera.
Beetle George Harrison above is due in court here today to answer assault charges.
Harrison is accused of assaulting a photographer last May as he and Beetle Ringo Starr left a nightclub. Hey!
Wearing raincoats, standing so low in the sun.
I find it an absolutely fascinating film, and there's something really odd about it as well, because I have these kind of weird associations with the Beatles, because I sort of grew up with the Beatles. I was born in 1960, so I became aware of the world just at the same time as the Beatles were hitting their stride. And so my formative years were just following this thread of the Beatles emerging. And I think it was probably quite late on in that process when I realised that the Beatles actually did create these things, that these things felt to me like fixtures in the firmament, that actually the songs that they created for me were things that could have been around for hundreds of years. They were just absolutely part of the landscape. So to actually go through that and then come out the other side when they break up, and then gradually relearn them as I got older, and then the fact that this film existed, or a version of this film existed, but was not viewable for such a long time, and then it was reworked into this incredibly detailed and quite laborious narrative of this experience. But what it revealed was what actually goes on around the creative process at a level that is not just people consciously thinking about how they contribute to a documentary about the creative process, but actually people who are creating things that have already become so deeply embedded in my own cultural landscape that they are inseparable from history, from the world, that they are absolutely part of that. But then actually to have the opportunity to see that being created is so powerful. And bizarrely enough, little clips of it just keep appearing on my Instagram feed. So I get a little dose of this in 30-second bursts most days for some reason. But actually, watching the sequence of the 3 films, which is I think 486 minutes or something like that, and seeing the evolution of a
lot of bang
process,
for your buck.
Absolutely.
On the moon.
High value. So for me, it was incredibly powerful, and also has these strange resonance. I was talking about the fact that I sort of grew up a little bit around structural filmmaking when I was at art school and afterwards. And there's something about the kind of, the documentary of nothing happening, which is incredibly seductive. This idea of like removing as much as possible so that you can see the tiny details of what is actually going on. But to have that documenting something that is so massively impactful is absolutely seductive. So I would love to sit and watch this film and just keep seeing new things in it and following the thread of the emergence of these works, but also picking out some of the lost bits of conversation and how they fit into that whole narrative as well. So yeah, for me, it was a really powerful option.
When I first saw it, I was sitting next to my husband on the couch and we were watching it together. And the pace was such that I could turn to him and say, I didn't realize that Paul was, such a guide and kind of kept that band together. And then he's like, well, the death of the manager really affected them. And then suddenly by like hour 2, we were in the room, but also talking about them in the room. And it was a pace that you could just be there. It was extraordinary, very zen.
I congratulate. I think it is perhaps the most brilliant choice that I've heard, including ones that you've changed my thinking, because what you did in your way is you got up there to the moon with a beautiful story that you can indulge yourself in, with wonderful music. That's not clean, but it's evolving, it's changing. You got different things going on there.
Yeah.
And if I were on the moon, it's now changed one of my choices. I would now bring A Hard Day's Night.
Which is great.
Because A Hard Day's Night starts with this. Whenever I'm feeling down or I just want to get totally pumped up, and I'm in the same, I grew up with the Beatles too. You turn on that movie and they're so young and they're goofy and they're working their own stuff and they're having fun and the music is glorious. And you get back, and it's probably only 10 years later, but they are now different. They are adults. And one of the things in the movie I love, it captures so many things. I think John Lennon says, I want to have a 5th Beatle. And Paul McCartney, without losing a beat, says, it's hard enough with 4 of us. And it kind of represents the fact that when you do something creative, you have people who are kind of in different directions. And how do you reconcile that? And the humor, there's a sharp humor with creative teams over time. where the masks go away and there's a connection between humor and warmth, but also a sharpness. You see again the glorious messiness and the happy accidents that come together for this. But now, thanks to you, we have beautiful music and that rooftop scene on the moon.
The whole rooftop scene in the film, they cover the whole extent of it, but actually they cut it in a split screen alongside the audience in the street, the people that are gathering in the street, and the interviews with them, and this wonderful little narrative, which in itself could be a film, of the police officer who comes in to try and stop it, and they've actually hidden the camera in a box in the foyer that he can't see. And the receptionist basically just knows to delay him. And so you get this whole narrative playing out of this very, very polite police officer asking if they'll let him up onto the roof so that he can sort of stop this concert from happening. And this whole subterfuge going on around it. So you get all these little narratives emerging within the film that are just fascinating.
Countdown sequence initiated. Do you know, not to play favorites, but Clive, you have chosen some of the coolest movies to take to the moon. I feel like you've upped our cool factor. And I really hate to see you go to the moon, but I know we're running out of time, and I want to know what your snacks are so we know that you're going to be well fed. You get one snack, but an endless amount of that snack, and then a book.
My snack of choice. Now, the moon is a very dry place, so actually most snacks don't really work terribly well in dry places. So what I would quite like is a bag of those tiny little tomatoes. The ones that have got, that when you cut them open, they have very dark green seeds inside. So just a bag of tiny little cherry tomatoes with a little bit of salt. So that would be my snack of choice, because actually that seems to go quite well with the arid nature of the moon.
That's a perfect choice. You get an endless amount of tomatoes. And what about your book?
I anguished about the book, actually, because I went through a phase when I read quite a lot about the moon. I was quite interested in the astronauts that had gone to the moon. And I actually made a piece of work. So there's a wonderful program called Celestia that is a program that allows you to navigate the universe through time. So you can actually position yourself in the universe anywhere and look back at the pattern of stars that exists at a particular moment in time. So I produced these series of prints that were based on each of the astronauts stepping out of the lunar module and looking back at Earth and the view they had of the Earth. So I got quite obsessed with the astronauts. There's a book by a guy called Andrew Chaikin called A Man on the Moon, which actually goes through and interviews those that were still alive, but actually follows how some of them chose quite interesting paths when they stopped being astronauts and where they went with that. So I got quite interested in all that, and I kind of thought, should I take a book like that with me to the moon? Should I take Asimov's Tragedy of the Moon, which is a really interesting, has this kind of double thesis about how the moon was essential to the evolution of civilization, but also was a barrier to the evolution of civilization. So there was all these things kicking around. But in the end, I kind of thought, well, actually, I'm going to be there. I don't want to read about it. I want to look back to Earth and try and read about the Earth in a way. So the book that I wanted to take with me is a book that I bought a very long time ago when I was a sort of pretentious young art student and felt like I need to read all of the kind of essential modernist literature. And I never managed to get through to the end. And it's also a book that is essentially about being human and being human within one day. So it's James Joyce's Ulysses, because I've never managed to get through it. And actually, this would give me an opportunity to get through it, but also perhaps a motivation to get through it, to try and get in touch with some of those ideas of what it is to understand I guess the 20th century, which is where I've come from, and that idea of the switch into modernism that is reflected in the book. So that for me seemed like an ideal book to spend time on. And because it takes place in a day, there's also a little bit of a play there on being on the moon and the different time cycles and allowing you to lock back into the 24-hour cycle of Earth through this book. So actually would have that connection as well.
Clive, by the time Ed and I decide to join you, you can then teach us Ulysses by James Joyce. I look forward to that. All of that is yours, Clive. That is just
Fabulous.
Really wonderful. Clive, I realized something as a little Easter egg. In addition to you cheating our system about figuring out how to get as much entertainment as possible, with your snack, you could technically harvest the seeds from the tomatoes and start growing them yourself.
Yep.
That was very clever.
Go for launch.
T-minus 30 seconds.
Roger, go.
Clive, it's been a joy. Thank you so much for being on our podcast. And we hope you're going to be comfortable on the moon. I think Ben always says that we need to actually physically send you there. So we're going to do a little...
Can I go in something that's perhaps as environmentally friendly as Wallace and Gromit's spacecraft?
Crew 1 for all.
Rather than anything that burns a huge amount of fuel. So something, like in A Grand Day Out. Do you know A Grand Day Out, where they go to the moon? Something like that.
Yes.
Tanks pressing for strawback retract.
Would you like to be slingshotted up there?
Oh, if that's possible. I'm not sure I could withstand the G-forces, but...
Falcon 9 is configured for flight.
Clive, we wish you a lovely trip.
Thank you.
Safe travels.
Endless tomatoes.
All right. I'm going to miss Earth.
Bye.
Delightful to have you with us. Thank you for joining us at the Fourth Wall podcast,
where we shoot people to the moon. And join us next week for our next guest and the next launch.
Fourth Wall was presented by Jessica Fox and Ed Hoffman, and they were joined by special guest Clive Gillman. It was produced, edited, and sound designed by me, Ben Please, for XpoNorth Digital.